Hello, my name is Joshua Blum, and I am your host on a show that I am calling Revive and Thrive, Actionable Steps for Physician Dads to Combat Burnout. My day job is a psychiatrist. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I work mostly with young adults in college settings. I have noticed over the course of past 5 years or so that the topic of physician burnout has come more and more into sort of a mainstream consciousness. That's one of the reasons for this podcast. I'm going to be very upfront with you. I am not someone that claims to have any answers. I am a psychiatrist by training, but like I mentioned, I work with children and young adults. This is not typically what I do. So you may be wondering at this point, why am I listening to this guy talk? What does he have to offer me? And why is he doing a podcast? Well, that's probably one area that I figured I could help because I have been doing podcasts for a totally separate reason since 2014. And I'm a writer and a musician as a side thing. And I've noticed that when I first started doing podcasts, it was not something that was very well known. It was something that a small niche knew about. And then over the past couple of years, they've really grown to a point where people are seeking them out, not only seeking them out, but they're garnering a lot of attention. And it's just a different way of conveying information. It's different from a written sort of thing. It's different from video. People are consuming them in ways that I don't know if any of us who first started them, started a number of years ago would have ever thought about. But I think it's great because it gives us just another avenue of sharing information in a much more kind of conversational and almost intimate way. So that's one way in which I hope I can share a few things to you. I don't claim to have any particular answers or anything like that, but I have studied this area a fair amount. So back when I was in residency, one thing we had to do was a grand rounds. And I decided to do my grand rounds on burnout because I was dealing with pretty bad burnout at the time. And I wanted to see if there was anything written about it and what could be done. There wasn't a ton, I would say at the time. This was probably around 2011, maybe something like that. I read whatever I could, and I did find it very, very helpful. And it led to a lot of answers that made me change my course quite a bit. But I just noticed that in the next 1 or 2 years, the whole thing kind of exploded. It's like the physician world kind of awoke to the fact that, people were struggling in this area. I can't say, unfortunately, that a lot of the stuff has come out afterwards has really been super helpful. And that's the point of this podcast. So I'm not going to have a lot of information about the understanding of it. That is important. Don't get me wrong. However, the point of this show is about things that you can do in your life, actionable steps that you can do, starting very, very small, because when we start small, it becomes achievable. When we start small, it's something that we can incorporate into our day-to-day life. And it's more the biggest thing I think I want you guys to get out of this more than anything else is to start now. Sometimes when I'm working with patients and they ask me, when do we start? Now. The answer is now. We start now with everything we do. There are always daily opportunities for practice. And so we're going to be talking about a number of those different things to do. None of these episodes are going to be long. They're all going to be relatively short because I know your time is precious. All of our times are precious. You need time to do other things. You need time to practice these different things. But it's just a little tidbit to introduce an idea. And then hopefully what we can do is that grow to a point where you will start to contribute things that worked, things that did not work, things that you understood, things you did not understand, so you can start to learn from each other. I'm just introducing an idea, and then I put it forth into the world to you guys. We're going to be following a very simple format, which is basically going from using the English alphabet, going from A to Z. So actually, we're going to start right now. The first letter of the alphabet is A. A, in this case, is for aim. And if you ever heard the expression, your attitude determines your altitude, or some variations on that, you kind of get the sense about what this is what this may mean. So I would also say that your aim also determines your altitude, how high you go. And which all sounds great, right? But what does that really mean? When you think about why we're in this career, right? Way back when you were applying for medical school, you had to answer some questions. Why do you want to go into medicine? Why do you want to be a doctor? Why this as opposed to other things? If you were anything like me, you may not have believed all the people or entirely understood all the people who told you, don't do this, or it's going to be a lot of work, you may have regrets, blah, 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 blah. Right? Or you got the other thing, and I got a lot of this. People who told you, oh, it's wonderful, this is your life's calling, this is the best career out there, you should never do anything else. Some variation on that. Some of you may in fact have been trained by people in medical school and in residency who basically lived to work. Now, I'm not saying that's not a valid way of going about life, but if you don't necessarily fall into that camp, then you may feel a little stuck. The biggest thing, as I mentioned, your why is so important. It's a question that we don't necessarily often consider, but when we're questioning ourselves, and one of the biggest things that goes along with burnout is we get to a point where we're not really sure if what we're doing is worthwhile. What we're doing feels in some way meaningless. Now, we can take all the vacations and do all the yoga classes and go to as many retreats as we can, but still, and I'm not saying those things are not helpful. They can all be helpful. But the main thing is when you actually are at work, if you're not finding meaning in what you're doing, if you think it's at the end of the day a big waste of time, or it feels like it's just mind-numbingly either boring or it's overwhelming or some variation on that, it's going to be really hard for those times when you are at work. And as a physician, you're going to be at work quite a bit. Just no real way around that unless you're retired. So what do we do about that? We have to come back to our why in some way. Why are we doing this? What is it about what we do that in some way makes it worthwhile? One thing I will say, in addition to just remembering what you said in medical school, what you said in residency, why do you want to go into whatever specialty that you go into? You had to do interviews. You had to tell people that. What was that? Do you no longer fit that profile? Are those answers not actually accurate? When we make decisions, we often make decisions almost always with information that is incomplete. So when we said we wanted to go into whatever specialty, we didn't really know what it was like. We made a decision based on the information that we had. We did the best we could. The practical reality may in fact be very, very different. But here's the thing. Where do you want to end up? This is the thing that we need to keep in mind. Where do we actually want to end up? What do we want our life to look like? Regardless of what we do, regardless of where we have to go to get there, where we want to end up. So remembering where we started and where we want to end up, those are two very important things, two benchmarks, so we can kind of know how far we are from where we want to end up. So I would encourage you to write different things down. Just jot down anything. Jot down on a piece of paper, jot down on the Notes app in your phone, on a napkin, wherever, but someplace where you can find it, and jot down the reasons that you thought you wanted to go into medicine, the reasons why you wanted to go into whatever specialty you chose. Now that you have some experience in that field, where do you actually want to see your life going? Do the two match up? If they match up, then they're great. You probably don't necessarily need this podcast, or you may not necessarily need this particular episode, because you know where you want to go. Having that kind of clarity is incredibly important. It's one of those things we don't think about enough, especially after you become attending. But if there's some incongruence between those two things, then I would say then that is important for you to note, because there's a gap there, and that part of that gap is where burnout comes from. So start now. Start thinking about these things. As I'm recording this, I'm actually with my children, and you may be able to actually hear them in the background. But if we waited for the exact perfect time to do anything, in this case, it's recording this podcast, I could wait until I have sort of pristine conditions, so there wouldn't be any background noise and things like that. Now I can edit those things out and that kind of stuff like that. But there will be distractions, right? There just were. And a few minutes ago, you won't see that or hear that in the podcast, but that's life, right? And so if we waited for the perfect moment, we would probably never do anything. And so again, the biggest thing I want to convey is that there are things that you may in fact be able to do right now. And as an example, that's why I'm doing this show in sort of unideal conditions, where there's potential for interruptions, screaming, yelling, fighting, all that kind of stuff in the background, because that's what children do. But that's our life, right? As we're talking, this is a show specifically for physician fathers. And as you probably are aware of in more ways than one, being a parent is incredibly difficult in many ways. It also can be very fulfilling. And how you go about balancing that with your working life, which can also have all those exact same things, is something that I have not heard many people talking about. But is not one of those things that we were ever, at least I was never trained in formally, not in medical school, not in residency, certainly not in anywhere else in schooling. There was never that discussion about how you go about balancing things. So we're going to be talking about aspects of that because we live unbalanced lives. And I think the more we try to achieve a state of equanimity or balance, all the time, it's probably unrealistic. So some of the anxiety that comes about from our state of being, we end up often generate because of expectations. So I'm going to leave you with that because the time, as I mentioned, is now. Look at your aim. Look at where you want to end up. See if there's differences, and I'll talk to you next time.